The XY Advisor crowdfund is now live. To become an investor, head to virtual.com/company/XY Advisor. Make sure you read the offer documentation. It would be great to have you on as an investor. So feel free to join the cap sheet. Okay, on to the podcast. This podcast is with Chris Bates, who's a very recently former financial planner, who's focused on how to include property in the advice process for like the last 8 years. He's just handed his license in to focus completely on mortgage broking, but before he sort of sails away into the distance, I've said to him, what you learnt in that 8 years is so fundamentally important to the positive evolution of financial advice that can you please come and teach as many advisors as possible, which he's agreed to. So he's doing the next 30-day challenge on the XY platform. So if you're not already signed up, xyadvisor.com, or just go to your app store and download XY Advisor. Now, when you're on the platform, on the left-hand side menu, click Courses, and it should be right up the top. It says View Course. That's where it's going to be held. So it starts on the 1st of September, goes for 30 days. It's totally free. Be great to have you there. Cheers. Welcome to the XY Advisor podcast. To join a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice, head to xyadvisor.com. G'day, how's it going? What do you know? Striker Like Clayton here from XY, and we've got Chris Bates on the line. Mate, what's happening?
Clayton, good to see you, mates.
Yeah, good to see you as well. Property. Now, XY stuck a question up on the platform the other day, and it said, how confident are you with delivering advice around property? Now, actually, most people were pretty confident, but there was, I guess, the occasional response, which goes back to, I guess, the fear of an advisor being involved in property, and that is somehow getting caught up in the wrong mob, if you want to call it that. There are people that are somewhat concerned that they can end up, somehow involved in this off-the-plan property development, and there's this implicit, I guess, worry that an advisor is going to be looked upon in a negative light when they get involved in property. You know what I'm talking about. What can you articulate that fear a bit better? And can we start off with that?
It's a genuine fear. And to be honest, because what you're saying is, I've got a business and I've got a clientele that I care about, and I want them to get great outcomes. And my biggest fear is that I can refer someone, other professional, not just property, this is any accounting, tax, legal, whatever it might be, a referral to end passing your value and your business to someone else. And if that doesn't go very well, then what's going to happen to everything, right? And your clients might know other clients. And so you've got to be super careful who you refer to. And I think in property, because it's unregulated and anyone can say anything, unless you know who to refer to, you're basically risking everything and your whole relationship with your client and your client's futures on someone who's got a great pitch. And unfortunately in property, everyone's got a great pitch because it does attract a certain type of property spruik, I would call it. And the commissions that they can make are massive, right? And so you've just got to be super careful who you refer to. And, I've been looking at this area for the last 8 years. Vast majority I would go nowhere near because unfortunately they refer to poor property, and a lot of that's new property where the big commissions are.
Yeah. And so I remember meeting you for the first time about almost probably when you mentioned that, almost probably about 8 years ago. Yeah. And you'd sort of recently had come over from the UK where you'd had some experience there as a financial advisor. And then for the first few years, and it was the same with me, we're sort of a bit newer to Sydney and we're sort of trying to figure out exactly where we wanted our advice to go. And you pretty early and pretty quickly went down the path to get involved in property. So now when I say get involved in property, I don't mean you've somehow joined an investment or development firm, I should say. But rather you got involved in buyer's agents and then mortgage brokering and things like that. Over the course of the last 8 years, what has been your experience in being a financial planner who talks about property to their clients? What has your clients' reaction been now that, well, certainly over the last 8 years, you got better and better at bringing that conversation into the advice process?
So I'll go two ways. The first thing is question you put up on the platform, which is an amazing platform. Hats off to you, mate. Around people being confident. I still feel that I'm learning lots about property now after 8 years, where I think, wow, I wouldn't have looked at things like this a year ago, etc. So it's so much there to learn and grow. And we're still learning. And so I feel like a lot of advisors, even I've been down this journey for the last 8 years, I feel like there's lots I don't know about property. So I think it's one of those things where you keep on, growing your knowledge, I guess. I think it's really difficult. I mean, I was very fortunate when 2012, when I came back from the UK, I was looking for a new job. I was jumping out of a dealer group that was, I didn't love. And I was, fortunately, I joined a financial planning business that incorporated property. But when I went to that interview, I didn't know a single thing about property, how even thought about it in the advice conversation. And I was just very fortunate that they had very good property ethics. They didn't buy anything new. They stayed away from all the developers. They worked with buyer's agents, etc. So it was just lucky that was my grounding. And then that started the sort of conversation and the learnings, etc. I think it's really difficult, and hence why I've given up my financial advice license to be a great financial advisor and do advice around insurance and super and investment portfolios and cash flow and coaching and accountability, etc. And then also be a great mortgage broker, and then also be great at property advice, etc. So what I think you need to do is actually be skilled in the conversation, but then have the great broker or have the great buyer's agent to refer your clients to, not try to do it all, including brokering, which I just think is just too difficult. Hence why I've taken that sidestep.
Interesting. And from a buyer's agent point of view, they very much work on a fee for service, right? So they will charge a price to source a property, to find properties, and to help negotiate the property. Do buyer's agents also receive some level of commission on the sale as well?
So some do. So, and this is one of the things that you've got to be super careful with, because I'll get lots of buyer's agents that'll come to me, or the property people, let's say, and within a few questions, I can figure out whether they've made a real big call as a business and say, we just don't agree with this type of product being new property, and we're going to avoid it, and we're not going to ever have anything to do with it in our business. A lot of buyer's agents sit on the fence and they say, well, maybe occasionally if the client really wants a new property, then we'll go there and we'll buy that for them. But they know that that's not a great asset. So they're just doing it because that's what their client wants, and it's an easy way to facilitate the transaction. So those sort of buyer's agents potentially will get a bit of a kickback from a sales organization, whether it's a big developer or something, for introducing their customer. So they could be double dipping. They may say that we give that back to the client, but for me, that's a great litmus test on whether they're a great buyer's agent if they've made that call and they say, look, we just don't do that for our clients. We don't agree with it.
Interesting. Now, for those of us who aren't as familiar with why new property is not a great investment, is it just as simple as, well, the property you're purchasing has a $40,000 commission on top of it, so from day one, you've lost $40,000 simply because you've over purchased on the price? Is it as simple as that?
No, there's lots of elements to it. So all property, like any investment, comes down to demand and supply. And so if you think about new property, well, if it's new, then that means it's new supply, and likely that if they've been able to build that building or that house and land package or that townhouse or the duplex, etc., they're likely to be able to build more of them. So you think about apartments, you buy a new apartment building in an area, if it's 10, 15 levels high, well, probably next door can build a new apartment building as well. So new generally fails a supply test straight away because it's there's no limit, there's no cap on supply. Whereas you think about like an house in an inner ring on a good street, can they build more of them? No. Can they build more Art Deco apartments in more established areas? Well, no, because they're 30, 40, 50 years old, and the planning laws in that area don't allow more buildings. So the first thing is the supply test. The second thing is what you're buying generally is a smaller block of land, and that land is very highly priced because it's priced at developer prices. And so you usually get a much smaller block of land and a building that depreciates really fast, hence why you get big depreciation deductions. So you're buying and land's what goes up in value. So you're buying a thing with lots of supply risk, you're getting very little land that goes up in value, and it's actually not great quality land. And you're buying like a building that's like a car that goes down in value. So there's all these sort of things. Then you've got the demand problem is that, generally the demand that wants them is more the affordability market, not the aspirational market. And it kind of goes on and on. Then you've got building issues. A lot of these new buildings aren't built like they were 30, 40 years ago. So go on for days around it, but there's lots of reasons why. Then you've got the issues with finance. If you buy the off-the-plan contract, which a lot of people are struggling with right now, is you don't get the finance today. You get the finance in 2 years' time when that building's finished. Now, will the bank lend on it? Will the valuation come in at contract price? Will you have a job? Will you have enough deposit? All these risks as well around finance that new property encourages as well.
Yeah, wow. That's a whole list of things that I'd never considered before. Is there anything else that you would consider on the flip side that makes good property a great purchase? Like, what is it that you're actually looking for compared to what you're not looking for?
Yeah, so this is where I think sometimes people go with buyer's agents and they starting out the journey and they go, right, I don't need to buy any new property, so I'll just find one buyer's agent and then they will be able to buy everything for my clients. And unfortunately, that doesn't work. And what you actually do is you lose your independence and you just start funneling business to this one person. And they're only going to be skilled at one market or a couple of markets. And so they're not going to be able to give you the best service for your clients, because to actually to offer a great service to your clients, you need to have a variety of people, because everyone's got different capacity, right? And so if someone's got $1 million to spend, you might be able to look at, say, a great apartment in Sydney in a more premium suburb, or a house in Melbourne, etc. But if you've got $500,000 to spend, that'll send you to different markets, etc. So you've got to have lots of different relationships with lots of different buyers agents, because everyone's got different capacity, everyone's got different needs, they want to buy in different areas, etc. So that's a big mistake people make. In terms of what makes a great property, so firstly, the supply test, can they build more of them? And so if that's a no, and if it's shrinking supply, so generally there's less of them every year, you're probably in the right place already. Then you've got to kind of figure out, well, who really wants the property? So what sort of the demand side? And better properties have greater demand. So it might be more buyer pools, it might be couples, it might be young families, older families, downsizers. And the more people that want your property, the better. And then secondly, it's got to be the aspirational side of the market. It can't be the affordability side, because you really want people with money to want your property, not now, but in the future. So you've got to buy properties that, ideally people who have got high incomes or are going to have high incomes in the area, or have got lots of cash. So like cashed up downsizers. So generally when you think about that, you think, well, where do people on high incomes want to live? And where are they going to want to live? Well, there's a pre-COVID world and a post-COVID world, which I think is shifting things. So pre-COVID, they wanted to live around the inner ring of the capital city. So they would reduce their commute time so they could get to work and spend more time with their family. Like that's fundamentally what they're trying to achieve. And they need a house, and they want to have a house that's got great lifestyles. So you've got to think, well, what type of properties will suit them and what are they looking for? And then can they build any more of them? No, hence why prices of those properties kept going up. So yeah, there's a lot to it at a system sort of macro level that you've got to kind of understand. Once you understand that, then you can start to go out and look at property, but you've got to do that groundwork first.
Interesting. Now, pretty shortly, you've got a 30-day challenge on XY coming up, which is awesome. Is this the place that people are going to learn, who and who not to refer to clients? Because, yeah, like as an advisor, you kind of as you know, you walk into a situation where you've got that very much that protective mentality, that you've done, so much hard work to I guess, build a reputable business that delivers, a lot of value. And as soon as you walk into property land, it's full of sharks. As someone who's probably spoken to, well, not including your very successful podcast, Elephant in the Room, and so not even including that, but you've probably spoken to so many, say, buyer's agents in the past. How do you go about, interviewing? And because from their point of view, you end up being a referral source for them. So they're obviously very attracted to the conversation, and it's your job to come up with, it's your job to protect your client so you're not feeding them to the sharks. So how is it that you interview property buyers agents to ensure that they end up with a good result? Like, do you demand things like a disclosure of all fees and commissions? And like, how is it, like, what, do you have a checklist? Like, what do you do?
Yeah. So I will, for sure, on the course, at the final sort of session, I guess, I'll kind of explain, look, these are lots of people to follow, to watch, like to, read their content, to refer business to, etc. These are the people that I trust, right? And I think it's important for people to have that. Are they the only buyers agents out there? No, but I have, like you say, met lots. I think a really good basis for buyers agents, for example, is REBA, which is like an association for buyers agent. And that's not saying that every business on there I would refer to, because I wouldn't. Because I think that, but they've got a good standard. You've got to be a buyer's agent for 2 years. I think experience is a huge thing for buyer's agent. And while I believe that everyone's starting out and everyone deserves a go, if it's my clients that I'm going to refer someone to, and I've got the choice to send it to someone with lots of experience or someone who's just starting out in property, I would definitely go with someone with a lot more experience, because there's so many learnings over the years and tracking the market, knowing what buyers need, buyers want, what sellers want. You can't get that knowledge. It takes time to accrue it. And so a buyer's agent that's, say, got 5 or 10 years experience in that pocket that you want to buy has got so much value that they can add, so you're much better off to use them. And that's the other thing. It needs to be a specialist. Like, you can't just refer to a buyer's agent who's, say, based in Sydney, and then they say, oh yeah, I can buy for you in Brisbane, or I can buy for you anywhere in Sydney. For me, that's a big warning sign that you shouldn't work with them, because a great buyer's agent will say, look, I know the Northern Beaches, I know the Eastern Suburbs, I know the Inner West, and that's my market, and I know how to get a great asset in that market. And so great buyer's agents, they niche, and then they own a pocket, just like a real estate agent would.
Yeah. So I guess one of the major problems from an advisor's point of view, and this was certainly my case when I had my business, I sort of roughly had, loosely a buyer's agent, or a singular buyer's agent that I sort of engaged with and interacted with. And I sort of had a mortgage broker, that I was loosely aligned with. But because they weren't, I guess you would say, solid relationships, like, I couldn't trust that once I'd handed the client into their hands, that it wouldn't somehow backfire. And by that, I mean, they weren't experienced in financial planning. They didn't understand what it was that I did. And so because of that, there was always the risk that the client felt like they were just getting churned through the meat grinder, right? It's like, oh yes, you're this person who I see here, and it just didn't really take into consideration that overall, position that realistically, like, if you're a financial planner playing in the property space, that means you've made a decision to encompass a greater breadth of what their financial life looks like, feels like, you're guiding them through decisions that are far in excess of traditional financial planning. And so even to arrive at that mindset for yourself, to be able to manage that mindset in your client, you need to sort of think quite expansively. But my experience was, when I was sort of handing my client on tentatively, it was very much just, oh yeah, this person's in and out of the process. because financial planning is very hard for even financial planners to fully get their head around, let alone clients, let alone other professions that you work with. How do you, I guess, figure out how to include any mortgage broker or any buyer's agent, but more so the mortgage broker as well? How do you include them in that package deal, like that one experience? Like, how do you do that?
So I think with, and most people think, oh, okay, so he's left financial advice, he's doing this course, so he can get lots of leads from financial planning for his mortgage broking business. And that is definitely not the case. I mean, our business is doing really well and we're growing and we're already got way too much demand and supply and we can't even grow the team because it's hard to hire, etc. So even if every advisor sent me one client, it would crash our business. So that's not the reason why I'm doing the course. Why I'm doing the challenge is to help advisors get better at this property discussion. And so when they're sitting down with their clients, they can go, what's your assets, what's your liabilities? And when you're going through that process, and ask them questions around their home, like where are they going to live after this home? Do they need to do a renovation? Is it better off for them to restructure their home loan to increase their cash flow? Like, just to get good at these conversations. I think where you need to bring in someone like a mortgage broker is actually pre-advice. And I'm going to build the challenge around helping, the Gen X, sort of Gen Y customer, not the retiree, the downsizer, because the advice strategies there are limited around property. Generally, it's that sort of younger clientele that you really need to have great relationships around property, because two things: one, it's their biggest challenge, and two, you can add so much value to solving their biggest challenge. So how I'd work with a broker, which I will cover on the course, is pre-advice. It's your opportunity to kind of look at their current lending and what they can potentially do, because younger people are going to do one thing. They're going to want to buy their first home. So how much can they borrow? If they haven't got a property, well, you need a broker to explain that to you and have those numbers. So, pre your sort of strategy, you need that. But if they're a younger couple and they want to upgrade their home or do a renovation, that's where you bring your mortgage broker in and say, I've got this customer, how are they going to potentially upgrade the home? Can they use a relocation loan? Do they need to sell before they buy? And so a broker will run those numbers for you. And if they've, for example, got a house, they're happy there, and they're thinking about doing other investing, well, if you don't really understand the power of leverage and if they're on very high income and they've only got a small amount of equity, is it potentially better to, instead of using that equity to buy 100 grand worth of shares, is it potentially better to go and buy $1 million investment property, or etc.? So that's where you'll get your broker in and say, well, how do we actually figure out how much equity they've got? How much can they borrow? And so you use a broker to do the numbers for you. And then obviously in good faith that when if that customer decides they want to potentially buy an investment property or upgrade their home or do a renovation, then that's where you work with that broker. So you need a savvy broker, because, if the broker's there just focusing on rate, they don't really know how to do sort of structuring and strategy, then you'll really struggle, because you'll be asking for all these strategy sort of answers and they'll be saying, oh, Citibank, you've got a 2.59, that's such a great rate. So the broker, and then pre-advice, if your advice is considering different scenarios, surely you've got to figure out what those scenarios are with the help of a broker before you build the advice. So I think it's pointless to do an SOA before you've actually understand all the strategies around mortgages.
When you as an advisor, when you're putting in alternative strategies, introducing property, does that introduce more complexity, or does it introduce more hurdles for you to consider when filling out, what we've considered and chosen not to do? Or do you see it as a way to sort of say to the client, well, because there are people obviously that don't want to buy property for whatever reason. And for the people that scope out, they just decide that they don't want property. When you're sort of talking about alternative strategies, is it good sort of compliance to go in and say, hey, we considered talking about a property. These are the sort of things that, and at a later stage when you change your mind, because often people do, these are the kind of things that we would look at. And how do you approach a conversation about property with people that aren't interested in property?
So most younger people, and talking about younger couples, they want a house to live in. But if let's say they just want to rent for the rest of their life, a lot of those people change their tune as soon as they have a family because they want to have security and stability and send their kids to a certain school, and they might need to be in a catchment zone or something like that. So, most young people have some type of interest with it, whether they want to buy it for a house to live in or they, for example, want to, they've only got limited capital. So you can go and slowly kind of build your portfolio by, investing in index funds. And, even if those funds shoot the light out, unless they're leveraged, it's not going to compete with, say, the returns on a property, for example. Yeah. I mean, if it's people that, as part of good advice, even though I think you probably could do good advice without considering property as a strategy. But if you're saying, a person with equity and you're not considering a home upgrade as a strategy into a better home is, which is their biggest tax-free asset, right? If you think super's got great, tax status, well, your home's tax-free, for the next 20, 30 years. I think that's the biggest opportunity from a tax-free status. If you're not considering super, putting more money into super versus just paying off the mortgage, well, that's a simple sort of scenario. But if you're not actually considering that as a negative cash flow on a property, then, if you come back in 5 years' time, what was better advice? Well, potentially on a pure return basis, as long as if you bought a good property, and this is the big thing about the course is that, I don't believe in every property. In fact, I believe in very few. And that's where people go wrong is they go and just buy any property. And so, yeah, it's a whole sort of process there, but you're right. It's a big mindset shift. And if you want to work with younger people, then there's so much value you can add and so many strategies that you're probably not even talking to your clients about that they don't really know about. They don't really know how to solve these problems. And so you can become that expert for them.
Do you have a piece of software or maybe even a self-created tool that you use that shows different results for, let's say, a deductible, concessional contribution into superannuation compared to purchasing a property? Like, do you have a way to quantitatively show your clients the different types of outcomes that they can experience?
So, it's pretty simple to do, comparing paying off your mortgage at 3% interest rates versus salary sacrificing, an extra 10 grand into super, right? And show why the salary sacrifice into super is much better off because of the tax savings straight away, right? And especially because interest rates are so low on the home loan. But if you're saying the alternative of putting that 10 grand into super is a negative cash flow of 10 grand a year on an investment property, which will probably be after tax, maybe a property, say 800 grand, right? Especially when rates are low. Well, it doesn't take much for that property to dwarf the potential tax savings on 10 grand into super. Right. If a property performs at 3% a year, then you're going to dwarf the tax savings on your super. So the big problem I find with all these sort of spreadsheets, etc., is that you could look at older, past 20 years returns. And this is one of the questions we had on the platform is what returns do you use? Definitely don't use the returns that the market's performed over the last 20, 30 years. Because if you do that, you're going to, think that the returns are going to be much greater than they probably will be. And so you can do these amazing sort of forecasting. I know as an advisor, for 13 years that it was all about sort of scenario analysis and forecasting it out to people of 65, etc. But the growth rates that we use, even on investment returns, it's hard to say that that's going to be what the growth is going to be over 20, 30 years. And in fact, you actually don't need to use anywhere near that to still make it a great decision. So I do, but that's a really simple one where you go home, pay off the home loan, put money into super versus buy an investment property. Even with a very low return, it's still going to be better to buy an investment property over super.
Cool. At what stage would you introduce the fact that if someone's coming to see you, I guess it's a little bit different with you because I'm imagining most people before they came to see you would have been familiar with your, I call it micro blogging on your LinkedIn. And so they're probably well aware that property is a part of the conversation that you would have been having before they walked in. Let's assume that we removed your title of the Chris Bates of LinkedIn, right? Like let's totally remove the thousands probably at this stage that you've done. Let's say that someone contacted you, however they fell into your lead list, if you want to call it that. At what stage should someone be aware that property is a part of the conversation that's going to be had? Because it just never was, like property just did not fall into any single conversation that I had. And it was typically, I would wait for, and I'm sure most advisors are in this position, I would wait for my client to say to me, hey, we're thinking about buying a property. And it's sort of at that stage, I was like, okay, cool. Like, I know someone here, but not really. And I know someone here, but not really. It was very disjointed, and I certainly didn't get comfortable with it. It is a mindset shift, but at the same time, like I can absolutely see why it's a valuable mindset shift. So if you want to sort of take on this expansive role of what financial planning is, and like realistically, because property is such a huge asset to most people, it always does seem weird to me that it's not just an automatic thing that advisors deal with property anyway. But regardless, if an advisor wants to start introducing these conversations, where do they start? Do they put it on the website? Do they put it, as a part of the call, the initial, like how does someone who has typically not dealt with, property, let's say that someone does your 30-day course on the XY platform coming up, and they got a bunch of tools. They know how to have the conversation in the meeting. Let's say that they, go out and do the due diligence on mortgage brokers and on buyer's agents. But how do you introduce it? Like at what stage? Because it does sort of feel, at the end of the day, like the way that an advisor would look at it would be, it almost is an asset allocation or almost a product recommendation, but not. But like, so let's say I would traditionally say deal with SMSF, not a lot, but I used to do a little bit of that work. I never used to talk about that before the person came. That just ended up that the people who wanted an SMSF would end up in an SMSF. But I'm feeling like property's a little bit different, like because it's such a regular occurrence that it probably ends up becoming a part of your communication earlier on in the piece. And so how do you do it? How do you introduce property even at that early stage?
So it comes down to what you just kind of alluded to there in terms of, if you're targeting the SMSFs, right? You're building a client base that of wanting that as a product and want to give advice on SMSF. Well, you're probably targeting the sort of pre-retiree market because of the amount of money you need in super, etc. Right? And there are people who are probably a bit more interested in that, are people who are taking their super a bit more serious, etc. So, and then you want to pivot from that type of clientele into property. You're kind of wasting your time a little bit because, there's probably lots of other things you can get really good at is probably the conversations around that transition, etc. Yes, you can add a little bit more advice around, this is what you can do in downsizing, and maybe you should use the 6-year rule, etc. And rent your property out and rent something in retirement and keep your house growing tax-free. And, there's some strategies there, but you're going to get much better bang for buck if you're going to take property serious, if your clientele you want to work with is that Gen X, Gen Y, because they've got so many decisions around property ahead. It's whether it's their first home, their upgrade, renovation, and then also, they're still working, so they can afford a negative cash flow. They're still generally building wealth, so they're accumulating. So leverage is going to be much more enticing to them than someone in their 50s and 60s, etc. So if you really want to be kind of great at this, well, I guess the thing that I did is, when I started the business, I was on the fence a little bit. I'd been working with young clients for say 2.5 years, pretty much, very few older clients, but I was still kind of like, I still need to grow a business. I still need to get revenue. So I'll still help these, 50, 60 retirees because, that's going to help, grow the business. And then it's when I said, look, this is just too distracting. Doing a sort of transition to retirement sort of strategy and then flipping to a first home buyer is just not great for the brain. It's not great for anyone. So if your listeners, young advisors are saying, well, I actually want to work with a Gen X, Gen Y, I don't want to work on the retiree space, then you definitely got to incorporate property, because without doubt, it's their biggest challenge. I know you said that clients weren't coming to you and asking for property, but why were they doing the cash flow? Why are you saving? Well, I want a deposit to buy my first family home. So that's generally what most people will want, or they're, because most people are going down that route. Yes, people can say, I still want to build wealth, but still the best way to do that when you're younger is probably using your income as leverage to kind of grow your wealth that way. So I think it just comes down to your clientele. If you really want to work with younger clients, you've got to get great at the property discussion, because it's just one of the best tools in your kind of toolkit. And it's one of their biggest challenge, if not the biggest.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So assuming then that you're speaking to that younger client, and obviously, Chris, we're not as young as we used to be. So what do you currently classify as a young client?
So I think most clients won't we get very few clients in their 20s. We do, and I love it. I'll get someone and they'll say they're 23 on the phone. I'll just, get excited, because I think, good on them. But most people come to advisors around 30 sort of thing. They start taking their life a bit more serious. And if someone comes in their 20s, great. But generally, people are coming in their 30s. And some, I'm sure every one of your listeners right now have seen clients and they've never got advice. And they come into you at 53 or 54, and then they say they want to retire in 6 years' time. And you're like, how am I going to do that? And you've got to kind of be this sort of magic wand over their finances. And the reality is it's just impossible to facilitate. And so, I think, most clients that we love to see is that the new couples, or, they might be singles, but they, want to do something for their future. And they might be like, well, I've saved hard in my 20s. Now I want to buy my first home or et cetera. So, but then it's the people who have got, bought a place, they've lived there for 10 years and they're in their early 40s. They're great advice clients because, there's a bit more going on, but they've got lots of challenges around property. So yeah, it's probably anything from the 20s to the mid 40s.
Yeah, okay, that makes a bit more sense. Which was my target demographic when I was advising. And I guess I'll never forget the day that my client calls me up and he goes, oh, I've just bought a property and I need to sell down the leveraged, there's a couple of 100,000 leveraged portfolio that we had and to use as the deposit. Right. And then there was like, I can't remember the exact time, but there was a certain time limit that the money needs to get in by, because if not, there's problems. Yeah. And mate, that was pandemonium to make sure that this, relatively complicated strategy was unwound immediately. And I remember having to go to the offices of the particular product providers that were used in this strategy, because it was so difficult to get it done in this certain time. And I remember sort of being flummoxed. I was sitting there going, I can't believe that I'm this guy's advisor. And he was a great client. We got along really well, but I can't believe I got so blindsided by the fact that he had made this huge financial decision and I wasn't a part of that decision. And realistically, it wasn't his fault. It was because at no stage had I ever, I guess, taken that conversation on to say to this client, hey, actually, we should be thinking about this together, and you shouldn't be making any sort of rash decisions without me. He would ask me, if he should invest in some startup investing. I said, look, this isn't advice. It's definitely, but if you want to take a portion of your money and sort of play around with it and be a little bit risky and completely outside of what we do, I can understand, and we can have a conversation about it. But certainly, there's no decision or no personal advice involved in this conversation. but we wouldn't have that with property as well. And it was kind of like the whole thing, just sort of how it happened, was my real sort of dawning moment on the fact that all this time I should have been speaking to him, or at least letting him know that when he was ready to make these decisions, that as his advisor, I'm a key part of that decision.
Yeah.
And so it just so happened that I was already in the process of selling the company. And so I never sort of walked down this path. But if I was still an advisor, I would like to think that if I wasn't already, fixing that part of my process up, that I would be certainly signing up to learn from you because of your, I guess, methodology, your revenue model from an advisor who's been working with property isn't that sort of, that, let's call it the one that advisors don't like, which is there's many names for them. And I don't want to use anything insulting, but, those kind of companies that have SMSFs and they have property development as a part of that. And it's just sort of a bit of a one size fits all, a bit of a shop that some companies out there have done. And advisors don't want anything to do with that. And you haven't been a part of that, but it's really rare to find advisors, specialists that have done it the way that advisors like to approach and should approach advice, which is that sort of arm's length. What's the best interest of the client, and how do we take care of all facets of their life? So, mate, I'm really excited. Interestingly, the challenge that we had beforehand was run by Adele, and it was really about how to get in front of as many people as possible using LinkedIn. Bloody hell, you could have run that challenge as well, mate. So it's definitely the platform for Chris Bates to tell people what to do. So thank you so much for doing that. By the time this podcast gets out, we may already be launched, but if people haven't already joined and want to join, how do they do that?
So yeah, I mean, your platform is you probably know better than me how to do it, but I think you're right. Like, I think, your story there is very relevant. And if you've got sort of that young clientele and you're seeing yourself as that trusted advisor, like whether everyone wants to call themselves that trusted advisor, well, you should want to be that advisor in your client's mind. So whenever something they've got to do with their finances, you're the one that pops up. And if you're not there for that property decision and you want to work with young clients, then for me, you're not really solving their biggest problem. And so I think that's why hopefully through the challenge, you can become better at that. And it won't just happen overnight, but I think in 30 days, you'll have a lot of the 80-20 rule, right? The foundations on what you need to know, what paths not to take. And that's probably the key thing. And hopefully then, help your clients make better decisions and ultimately be that trusted advisor for them long-term, which is what we all want to be.
Awesome, man. Well, look, thanks for spending a bit of time with us today, sharing. I'm pretty pumped that this is coming up. So yeah, man, thank you.
Thanks, Clayton. Appreciate it, mate. Cheers.
Cheers, mate.